question that you might have on this discussion. We noticed that there has been relatively little interaction in the last half hour, so please feel free still to interact. We think it's important that we get into this discussion. But first, let's hear about the guests of this panel, and I think we should start with Kathleen Searles. You have researched a lot about media bias and about the way that things are reported. What is your take on the election and how that played out ultimately to the electorate compared to how it has been reported?
Yes, hi, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you guys today. So yes, as you noted, I study media and politics, and in particular how news consumption patterns affect politics in the US. And I think that my conclusion following the 2020 election is really one that centers attention to politics, to our understanding of the 2020 aftermath. And what I mean by that is a lot of the talk in the US in the lead up to the election, but also after the election, has been a story of polarization. And my argument is that based on what we're seeing from the news patterns and how they affected voters in the US, is that really we have a story of attention to politics or not attention to politics. And recent work suggests that most people in the US are not paying attention to politics. In fact, work by Yana Krupnikov and John Ryan suggests that nearly 80% of Americans do not follow the news closely. And this is important because what it means is that when we're thinking about a really divided American public, as we are, and as we're trying to make sense of the politics following the election and what Biden faces as he takes office, then what we're really thinking about is a small subset of the American public, about 20% of the American public, that is very loud, is very divided, very partisan, has very strong attitudes. Now, from a media scholar's perspective, this is all important because we have a predominantly private media system in the US. And so media folks are incentivized to cater to the small subset of the public because they're the ones watching. And so they're more likely to do the sort of news and produce the sort of news that those people are going to watch. It's going to be more conflictual. It's going to be more divisive. It's going to reflect that audience. And perhaps that would not be a problem if it were not for the fact that we know from previous research that politicians often use news to better understand where their public is at, how their public feels. And so you can understand if we have a news corps that is incentivized to cover very partisan and divided Americans, and then we have politicians that are watching the news to get sort of a sense of where their public is at, then those politicians might conclude that the American public is hopelessly divided. I believe this to be sort of counterproductive to our understanding of the challenges that Biden faces moving forward and to governance in general. And so I think that the real storyline to really understand the challenges Biden faces is to better understand how one might govern when you assume that the American public is hopelessly divided. It's not a very productive narrative, right? Instead, and I think a lot of people in the audience would get behind a message like this, I think we really need to elevate and to center a better understanding of media and communication technology and how those things structure media choices and content and information people see. And more importantly, what subset of the American public is paying attention, what subset of the American public is not, and might those sort of flows, that sort of information environment better explain what we see in the public and how the public feels about politics, as opposed to this dominant, but I believe counterproductive narrative of polarization and the American public is very much hating each other. I think if we really center that kind of conversation, then we can overall have a more productive discussion of what sort of challenges Biden faces. We can better understand how the media affects the public and or how the media is not reaching the public and what that means for our understanding of public opinion in the aftermath of the 2020 election.
Thank you very much. I think the discussion about the divisive and inclusive elements will be a big part of this panel. Before we go further into that, I would like to welcome once again Christoph Bieber. My understanding is, Professor Bieber, that you have researched a lot about ethics in politics, and I'm interested in your take on this election that we have just seen and of which the results are still not entirely clear.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Well, maybe we have to wait a couple of minutes for the ethics part. I'd like to start at a rather regular political scientist because there were so many things interesting to that election. And I might start with two short sentences. At first, I am not surprised. And the second one is, we are not there yet. So I'm not surprised when you had an eye or two on the things that happened in the US during the last couple of months. You could get an idea that this would be a very difficult process of decision making and finding the results of the election. So you pretty early you got the idea that Donald Trump would do the things that he would really do the things he was talking and tweeting about a couple of months ago. And so it's not that surprising that we are in kind of a mess after having the votes counted and after having a result, but there is no clear sign on how the next really difficult step on the way into the next presidency will be taken. So there is the next short sentence: we are not there yet. I think we should discuss at the end of this conference the outlook into the next presidency. But still, as far as I know for today, there is no formal opening of a thing called transition. And so this could be quite a very interesting and nerving situation in the next weeks to come. So we do have a president-elect, and he might have an idea on how to start into the new presidency, but there is still somebody around who won't let him. And this is some kind of a mirror image of what we had 4 years ago when the Trump administration was the incoming administration. This might be a link to the ethics topic, because we had then, during the first month, the question about whether members of the former administration should stay in place and fulfill their duty as a member of the administration, or whether there were ethical requirements to leave office and not to work for Trump. And so now we do have some kind of a mirrored situation, and maybe during the next weeks we will have again those ethical questions on how to fulfill your duty as a public servant in a moment when somebody is trying to obstruct the transition to the next presidency. I would add 3 more short things, and I think I'm not that far away from what Kathleen already mentioned. When looking forward, I think we do need some kind of a new plot for America. There has been enough talking about plots against America, but now I think we need a plot for America. And from a political scientist point of view, you would include in that at least 3 ingredients. So the first one should be the notion that bipartisanship is a thing, or should become a thing again. So bipartisanship reloaded should be something the union has to talk about. And a second thing might be the condition of the media landscape in the US. So yes, there is a strongly focused on the market side of communication in the US. So we do have the media system that relies almost totally on the mechanisms of the market, and maybe it would help to steer a little bit into the direction of a more public-oriented media system as we do have here in Europe. That's a huge task, but the third ingredient I think I would need for a plot for America is even more complicated, and this is the structure of the electoral system. And if one was waiting for another hint that you maybe could do some things with these electoral college situation and the overall structure of the electoral system, then maybe you got this answer now. Of course, last word here, that is everything but difficult. And we Germans do know about the difficulty of modernizing electoral systems, because also we are not really able to keep our Bundestag small enough to work. So that's really a huge task, but I think to look forward and to get a grip onto a new form of politics in the US, you probably would need to do something on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your remarks. I dare say the plot thickens already. We are being told that there's a few audio problems with people watching the conference. We apologize. Our technicians tell us that this is the best they can do. So we hope that it's on the border of just acceptable. Maybe the miracle of being able to communicate across continents at the moment plays a little part in this, and we hope that we will be able to keep it up. Finally, I'd like to welcome Ron Nehring, I dare say a friend of the conference, back to IKPK. Ron, it's very good to have you, and you've been a long-term watcher and communicator in the American electoral system. So I'm interested in your current take on both the election and what will come in the future. How do you stand? What do you think are the big challenges ahead?
Yeah, thank you very much. Guten Tag aus San Diego, California. I'm delighted to join you, and I have a couple of thoughts that I share, both as an observer and for this election cycle, also as a former candidate, since I was a candidate for office and won in the November election. So I really view it from a very practical, on-the-ground perspective, as well as from the more abstract. Number one is, since our European friends will be most interested in, of course, the presidential election, Joe Biden becomes the first newly elected Democratic president since 1884 to not have a Democratic Congress as he comes in. Now, control of the Senate depends upon some special elections in Georgia that will take place on January 5th. But there really was no blue wave that came in with this election that was predicted. And one thing that I found surprising was just how far off the polling was yet again. All the polling leading into Election Day suggested a gigantic blue wave, a 1974 post-Watergate type of election, and that simply did not happen. Republicans gained a significant number of seats in the House of Representatives. As of right now, Nancy Pelosi will have a majority only of 3. Democrats only have a majority of 3 as of right now, if the trend holds, and that's a very, very narrow majority in the House. In addition, Republicans held all of the state legislatures that we held before, and that was expected to change as well. So there are a couple lessons that I draw from this as it applies to both the politics as well as the agenda going forward. Number one is that socialism is a big loser on the Democratic side, and there were many people on the far left of the Democratic Party who embraced socialism as an idea. And what we found is that white liberal voters, when they think of socialism, they're perhaps envisioning Denmark or Norway, even though we know those are not socialist countries. But there are many Latino and Hispanic voters that when they think of the term socialism, they're thinking about Cuba and Venezuela. And I think that part of what Brian Berry talked about in the last session, the success that Republicans had among many Hispanic and Latino voters, can directly be attributed to that embrace of the concept of socialism by some on the Democratic Party. So that's an important thing to note. There were various leftist ideas such as defund the police and the Green New Deal, which come from the more energetic left wing of the Democratic Party, but which Democratic members of Congress since elected have said were complete what I would call a boat anchor, meaning they were a big burden that they had to carry. And there are many Democrats who blame the fact that they lost seats in the House to this embrace on the Democratic side of these concepts of defunding the police and embracing what's been called the Green New Deal, which would produce dramatic increases in energy prices in America. There is also there is a backlash in parts of the United States to what some have described as the coercive utopians. And I'm not sure how that translates into German, but those people on the left who want to use the power of the state to coerce people to change how they live. And examples of that include banning gas-powered vehicles and trucks, such as California, the California governor intends to do, telling people that they shouldn't eat meat, that they're destroying the planet if they have a steak, that people need to live in a little box and need to live in an apartment near a transit center, and then if they live in a single-family home, they're destroying the world. And the notion that we have to allow our borders to be completely open, and that anyone who suggests that we should have an orderly immigration process is inherently a racist. There is a backlash to that kind of conduct, and those are many of those people voted for President Trump because they saw him as someone who would take on those people who were trying to basically coerce people in many suburban and rural areas into living a different type of life. And that is part of the reason why the Democrats underperformed so much beyond their expectations. They won the presidential contest, but that was not matched with what you would have expected in terms of having what we would call coattails in the American context, where other Democrats would be brought along. There are also some warning signs for Republicans, one of which is, if you look at the Southwest of the United States, the only state in the Southwest that voted for Donald Trump was Utah. All of the rest of the Southwest and the Pacific Coast voted for the Democrats. That's not sustainable for the Republican Party going forward. Suburbia, I disagree. I agree with some of what Brian Berry said earlier, who had a great presentation, but I disagree that Republicans are strong in suburbia. I could point to many, many suburban areas, including, for example, suburban Atlanta, which is traditionally Republican, that voted for Joe Biden in greater numbers than they have voted for Democrats before. And that is what tilted, for the first time in 28 years, the state of Georgia voted for the Democrats. And it's because of that shift in suburban areas. Republicans have lost 5 of the last 6 national elections in terms of the popular vote. The only election since 2000 where we have won a majority of the popular vote was President Bush's reelection in 2004. This is largely because, and we were able to win in some of those because the Democrats tend to be concentrated in cities and very populated states. But the Republican Party needs to be a truly majority party, and we need to think majority, not only winning in the Electoral College. My final point, as it relates to outlook for the Biden presidency, and no one should make any mistake, Joe Biden is the president-elect. He will be sworn in on January 20th. If Joe Biden and the Democrats indulge the left wing of their party, where most of the energy in the Democratic Party is, it will create a big opening for Republicans in 2022. We've seen this happen before. After Bill Clinton was elected in 1992, there was a proposal from Hillary Clinton to effectively nationalize health care in America that proved very unpopular. Republicans took control of Congress the next year. In 2008, Barack Obama was elected. He overreached with Obamacare, which actually passed, and a stimulus bill, which was seen as largely wasteful. That proved very unpopular. Republicans came back and took control of Congress in 2010, and we held on to it throughout the Obama years. So Joe Biden can either govern as he campaigned on a theme of unity and of centrism, and in that case, I think the Democrats will do politically better than if they indulge their more left-wing impulses, which is where the energy of their party is. If they overreach, it will create more of a backlash, and it will create a better year for Republicans in 2022. I have lots of other things to cover, but we'll leave it to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. Maybe just a quick comeback to this idea of banning, for instance, gas-powered vehicles. We have this debate in Europe as well, of course. And a few years back, the European Union, under an energy saving plan, outlawed the traditional light bulb. So it can only be energy saving anymore. And the repercussion was quite massive. So I'm just waiting for the next one to be about vehicles, and then sort of to really feel the power of this discussion. Before handing the next question to Sandra, just very quickly to our viewers, kindly write down your questions or let us know if you have one, and we are happy to bring you into this discussion. Otherwise, you will just have to listen to us going on in our own questions. Sandra.
I just want to follow up on the last thing Ron Nehring just said. So maybe it's even helpful that you're gonna have a divided government. So Biden is forced to stay in the middle because he can't bring through his policy because of the Congress is not on his side. So what's your take on that?
I think that having a Republican Senate could in fact be a tool that President Biden can use, because when he wants to say no to various more extreme ideas that come out of his own party, he could say, in effect, I love your crazy idea, but we can't get that through the Senate. So we're not going to burn any political capital on that and get that done. If you have a Democratic Senate, then you don't have that excuse to lean on. Also, Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, has stated that they will not confirm any controversial left-wing people to the cabinet. So if he were to try to appoint Bernie Sanders, who is not just a socialist in the description, I mean, a self-described socialist, as the labor secretary, for example, as has been suggested, it is very unlikely that he would be confirmed by the Senate. So there will be that moderating effect. Barack Obama didn't have to moderate because he had a fully Democratic Congress, both houses, when he first came in. And he overindulged his party's left-wing impulses, and Republicans took control back.
Okay, so thank you, Kathleen. Ron just mentioned Bernie Sanders and the perception of him being a socialist, but he made a movement, especially throughout the young generation. So how do you put this in your media perspective? How do you connect this to your theory of biased media?
Well, so Bernie is, I think, largely the exception to the rule. He has definitely built a movement that has energized a segment of the Democratic Party, particularly young people. It's more white than the Democratic Party writ large. It tends to be more male as well. I think it's hard to extrapolate too many conclusions from Bernie. He has 2 failed candidacies now. He obviously is very good at what he does with regards to mobilizing the people he mobilizes. His campaign has been pretty innovative in the way that they use media platforms, social media platforms. There's a lot to learn with that in that regard, but as far as drawing broader conclusions for the American public writ large, I think that that's difficult to do, or I would at least want to be cautious in doing so. The media certainly loves to cover Bernie because I think he can be controversial, and they like to cover controversy, even though Bernie certainly dislikes being covered by the media and is not a friend to the media for the most part. But as with any candidate that kind of can be outlandish, as with Trump, for example, the media loves to cover candidates like that. So that was definitely worked in his favor. Biden is sort of more run-of-the-mill as it comes to candidates. So perhaps we will see that he isn't the media's darling as much as Trump was. And not to say that the media always gave Trump positive coverage, but they always gave him a lot of coverage. So we'll see, and I'll be watching how that sort of media proclivities shape the way they cover the Biden presidency because of that.
Okay, thank you for your comment. I have a question for Christoph Bieber before we open up the floor to our audience. In the run-up to the elections, you wrote an article at Carta stating that the GOP didn't have a program for the next 4 years, and this might be somehow an expression of a new pragmatic approach in politics. Can you give us more information on your thoughts?
Yeah, we came up with the idea when following the virtual convention of the of both the parties, and there you could find a huge difference between Democrats and Republicans. So the Democrats did have some talk about the issues, and they tried to develop a new platform that the candidate and his running mate could use when addressing the voters, and the Republican Party did not. So they did not use the convention as a tool for manufacturing a new platform for their politics, and so they left it to Trump, and the result was some kind of a void. So there was not very much the Republican Party could refer to when it came to the campaign, but for Trump. And well, now he lost, and then there's the question: what's left, and who fills this void? And this is maybe you could perspective this as some kind of a chance for a redefinition or re-innovation of the Republican Party as a new programmatic platform. But right now, I don't see any politicians who are really keen on taking this as their primary target for the next maybe month or years to come. And so I thought this decision to stay away from a programmatic discussion about what does the Republican Party stand for, and how can we help our candidate in this campaign, might be not such a good idea. And so maybe this is the perspective of a social scientist or political scientist who thinks that conventions do have their function, besides the function to mobilize the public and build up a nice stage that media can bring up and use for their programs. So I think there should be a deeper idea of bringing the party together and talk about what are our goals. And so that's the question we do have. And as Ron mentioned, also the Democratic Party has to think about what kind of party what she wants to be. Will it be the more progressive, leftist, socialist party, or is it a more moderate form of a progressive politics? This is the question that Joe Biden has to address, and I don't think that this will be too easy for him.
Question. The first one with us is Hartmut Unger, and we hope that your image and yes, we can hear you well. So please, your question.
Okay, thanks a lot. And I want to connect to the last question of Mr. Bieber, but I would like to address it to Mr. Nehring regarding the socialist character of the democratic left. Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez a couple of days ago blamed immediately the centered Democratic leadership for not supporting left-wing candidates enough. And she stated that the results for Congress showed clearly that center candidates lost, while candidates with a clear profile, for example, on the state-run health system, insurance system, got the full support of their electorate. So how strong is this left wing of the Democratic Party in reality? And what I want to know in particular is how strong was the socialist tone of the Democratic campaign during the election campaign in this year. In Europe, you never heard about that socialist tone.
take that. So a couple of points. First is that, unfortunately for their party, people like Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, who comes from a very left-wing district in New York City, they do not always appreciate that their majority is not made in districts like hers. Their majority is made in moderate, competitive, centric districts. And in those districts, voters in an unusual, in a number of districts that was not predicted before, those voters took a look at what the Democratic Party had to offer as defined by people like Ocasio-Cortez and others. And they said, no thanks, I'm going to vote for the Republican. And that is why we picked up 2 districts in Miami, 2 districts in Orange County, California, and the like, because the entire Democratic Party wound up being tainted with this brand that was created by Democrats who come from districts where they can't be defeated anyway. So what works in Ocasio-Cortez's left-wing urban New York City district did not work in Orange County, California. And Republicans were very effective at taking those times when Democrats have sought to justify socialistic ideas and attaching that to their Democrat opponents to great effect. And that is why we see those results. Of course, it's entirely predictable that someone like Ocasio-Cortez would say, no, it's not my ideas that are the problem. It's the leadership's fault for not putting more money into certain candidates' campaigns. The leftists who won were running in left-wing districts, so it's no surprise that they would win. But the majority is not made there. The majority is made in those competitive districts, and in those districts, the Green New Deal, socialistic ideas, defund the police are big losers, and that's why you see the results that you have.
Actually, if I may, as a follow-up, Kathleen, how do you see this?
I'm sorry, I think Hartmut Unger is wants to add something.
We can't hear you, sorry.
Just a second, we will get back your tone on. So.
Thanks. May I speak now? Okay. The second part of my question, how strong do you believe is the left wing of the Democratic Party?
So from what I observe as a Republican outside of the Democratic Party is that the energy of the Democratic Party is in its far left wing. It is not, so number one, there are no conservative Democrats left anymore, whereas there were 30, 40, 50 years ago, there were plenty of conservative Democrats in Congress. They're all gone. And when you take a look at the performance of someone like a Bernie Sanders, who is a self-described socialist, who would never have been nominated in the Democratic Party of Harry Truman or John F. Kennedy or even of Jimmy Carter. He is far to the left of anyone the Democrats have nominated successfully in modern times. And yet he did very well 4 years ago and again this time. So that's where I see the energy of the Democratic Party is. Those people show up. They may not be the majority of the Democratic Party, but those people show up, and the world is run by those who show up. And I think that was one of the points made by the other speaker, that those people who are engaged have a great influence over those people who are not engaged.
I'll try again. Kathleen Searles, how do you see this conflict between, if you will, the more extreme parts of the parties and the more central parts of the parties play out in the media? How is that being reported on? Does that play a part in this equation, or is that not so important because of the inner party dynamics?
It definitely plays a part. And first, I would also suggest that very much through the same lens that Mr. Nehring just used, we could turn on the Republican Party as well. And look at Trumpism writ large, and the fact that, he lost the popular election again seems to at least be an indicator that the public rejects at least some of those ideas in their extreme. And so I think in both cases, we can think of the party and certain elements of the party that have tended to be very loud, the far left and the Democrats, and Trumpism on the right, were rejected in this election, and how a party as an institution moves forward with such loud elements being rejected writ large is one for institutional scholars to dig into further, and it will take some time for us to understand. But as far as media coverage, media loves to cover intra-party and inter-party conflict. So anytime we have far left or far right elements that are really going after the leadership of their own party, that's the sort of bread and butter of media coverage. Not only do audience members really like to hear about in-party fighting, it's far more exciting than, say, AOC giving credit to leadership and vice versa on the other side for the Republicans. So we tend to see that sort of coverage the most. And politicians are not dumb, they do this strategically as well. AOC and those that are energized on the far left that tend to be the more loud voices, and the same thing with the Republican Party, they know that the media likes to cover them and give them airtime when they're criticizing their own. And so we're going to see them take advantage of that, use that strategically to get on their airwaves, and then the news media are going to cover that to deliver the sort of news that their audience really likes to watch, to click on, to like, to share.
You said the audience like to watch it. I've been to the US for the Super Tuesday, and I've been exhausted watching the TV. So do you have the feeling that people get exhausted from this polarization? And is there a reflection within the media that they have to not just follow this path, but maybe do something different?
Yes. So I think in the US, and I'm not sure if you guys have experienced the same thing, there has been very much this discussion of news exhaustion and avoiding news as well-being. And in part, that's, I think, because we have had such an extraordinary 4 years and a president that's very much in the public eye, often communicating via all sorts of platforms. And often that coverage has been contentious. And so people have just tuned out, in part because it's a lot to deal with. There's a lot of news, there's a lot of information coming at us from all sorts of sources. But I would caution everybody to draw too many conclusions from this. Just because we sort of have seen 2020 to be an unusual year, and we've seen a lot of people talking about news exhaustion, we have to remember that the people, many of us, for example, the people that are watching here, are still unusual in as much that we follow news pretty closely at all. And so it is difficult to extrapolate too much from us, even though, we would like to think that people are engaged in the news and following politics closely, because we are, our friends are, our family is, the people we interact with are. But we have to remember, at least in the US context, that most Americans are not paying that much attention. They're not waking up stressed about what the president tweeted that day. They're going about their daily lives and maybe occasionally interacting with politics in the news, maybe occasionally talking about it. But for the most part, that's not their day to day.
Thank you. I would like to include Philipp Gräfe into this discussion. You had a question on the more extreme parts of the Republican Party as well. So your question, please.
Me again. I'm in a parliament in Berlin, and it is a question to Mr. Nehring. How do you explain that a lot of people who are decent people who are working in their communities, who believe in God or are religious, how they respond or how they can vote for Mr. President Trump, for Donald Trump, who is pushing the borders on morality or who's just lying? How do you explain that they still vote for him?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and one which I've worked to understand at the same time. And first, let me tell you that people vote for Donald Trump for different reasons. And part of it is he's the Republican nominee, and so people will always vote for the Republican nominee. There's a large segment of people who will do that. There's also a normalcy bias in that if you're the president, you have all the trappings of the presidency. There is a bias on the part of people to naturally believe that that person is normal, and what's coming from there is normal because they see all of the other elements that they're used to as well. Those are certainly factors. There's another group of factor which is related to the intensity of support for him, and that goes back to what I was saying earlier. there is an active effort on the part of people on the left in this country to change people's lives, to change the way they live, and not to simply be content to let people live how they want to live, but to use the power of the state to change their lives. And the most dramatic example is the California governor issuing a decree to ban all gas-powered vehicles in California in 10 years. Now, we can argue over whether that's actually a sane and rational policy or not. But the reality is that for people in my community here, which is a very Republican area, hardworking people who rely on their Ford F-250 truck that they use to, to go to work as a roofer or a plumber, et cetera. And then the government is going to come along and say, you can't drive that anymore. You have to buy, a Cybertruck from Elon Musk for $100,000 or whatever. There are people who respond very negatively to that, who just want to be left alone. They don't want to be told that you have to sell your house in order to be better for the environment because of climate change, and you need to move, to the city of San Diego and live next to a train station because that's what we in government have decided you must do for whatever reasons we have decided. For people who are hunters or want to have a firearm for personal protection, no, you're bad. You have to get rid of that. And the more extremist elements on the Democratic Party will take that away from you. Those people vote for Donald Trump because that is a vehicle by which to tell the people who are trying to coerce them to go to hell. And there is a strong sense of that, particularly in areas such as where I live. I live in the hills outside of San Diego, about 30 miles outside of the city. There is an astonishing number of Donald Trump flags still up in front of people's homes. And so why do those people vote for Trump? Because they are voting for him as a vehicle for them to express their opposition to being told by leftists in government that they have to change how they live for whatever lofty excuses. And people are not willing to do that. And so that is, I believe, part of the reason why you have that level of intensity and that level of support from people who you might not otherwise think would support a candidate like that. And so this is an example of how when the left oversteps, when they take it too far, when they go beyond what people are willing to accept, voters will find a vehicle to reject that. And for many, Donald Trump is that vehicle.
Yeah. Thank you, Ron. I would like to follow up on this. Donald Trump was like the main character in some of the Lincoln Project spots, and if I understand it right, it was a Republican project countering the tweets of the president and trying to like demobilize the Republicans, the Republican voters. Can you give us a little insight on this project, how this affected the discussion within the GOP, and if it was perceived as it was in, for example, in Germany?
Yeah, so there are very, very strong feelings within the Republican Party about the Lincoln Project and the people associated with it. So my answer to this question, I'm going to try to be as analytical as I can and dispassionate as I can about it.
Yeah, genau.
The Lincoln Project, I believe, was very effective in terms of going after President Trump in areas that would drive him crazy. And they deliberately would make television buys in Washington, D.C. during Fox programs that they knew the president would be watching. Now, why does a Republican organization or why does any political organization spend money on television in Washington, D.C., which is a very left-wing city? And we all know it's not to affect the voters, but it's to go after this audience of one. And I believe that their television advertising was better done and more effective, both thematically and creatively, than much of what you saw from the Biden team. Did it have an effect on the level of Republican support for President Trump? It did not. because self-described Republicans voted for President Trump in either at the same level or even more than they did 4 years ago. Now, what we can't calculate is how many people were Republicans but left the Republican Party and now describe themselves as independents. They would not be part of that calculation. So it's very difficult to see what type of impact they had in terms of raw numbers, but certainly they were major drivers of the discussion, because those ads that they ran would also get picked up on the cable news channels, which were watched by many, many more people than originally saw those ads. So part of what you see in American on a national level is advertising that's created and runs not to primarily to reach the people who are watching, which might be a very small audience if you have a small buy, but what they're trying to do is impact the news programs on CNN and Fox and MSNBC and force them to cover the issues that they want. And I think they were effective in terms of helping to drive some of the national discussion there. So I think for many years to come, political scientists and social scientists will take a look at what the real impact was. One final point where I think they went a little too far is when they made it an objective to give Democrats control of the Senate, because there are plenty of Republicans who might be uncomfortable with Donald Trump, who have no interest in having the Democrats be given control of the Senate. And so I think that was a strategic decision that they made that I think cost them support, at least from some areas. Although I would imagine that they raised more money from Democrats by doing so. But at that point, it ceased to be just an anti-Donald Trump project, and it became more of the equivalent of a Democratic Party super PAC.
What I would like to do in these final 15 minutes of this panel is to look to the future. And this is also to bring Christoph Bieber back into this discussion, because my understanding is, Christoph, that you made a few suggestions on what could be changed, how politics, how, for instance, the Electoral College, how the flow of politics could be changed, maybe even with, as we said before, an ethical outlook. And I wonder where that discussion stands at the moment, because my impression is whenever you have a private conversation with anyone from the US, they all say, yes, we agree, it's broken, it shouldn't be this way, or at least many people would say so. But then ultimately nothing changes very much. And I'm interested, like Christoph, maybe you go first, but then also the other participants, is this an incorrect view, or is it just such a divided perception on how change should come about in the future? Where does this discussion lead? Will there be any changes in the future?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I think change is needed, but change is very difficult to implement into the political system of the US. Just to get back to the notion that there was some kind of an unlikely support for Trump by quite religious people. So you have to look at the supply side. You only have two parties, so there are not too many alternatives you could turn to as a voter. And so this might come back on the question, what's next when it comes to new ideological ideas for either one of the parties. We talked about the socialist movement inside, or the dynamic socialists inside the Democratic Party. It's difficult for them to take a stand inside the organization. In Europe or in Germany, you probably would have separated from the party, and we had some of those separations for lesser reasons maybe than you have right now in the US. But it wouldn't be really a good idea to form a really socialist party in the US, because you wouldn't have any chance of winning some districts and a seat in the House. So there is a limit for innovation. What I think what's needed, and I think the notion grew during the last month, is when it comes to the role of the digital media platforms and the impact they have on any form of political discourse. And I think we followed, or we could follow some steps in the in a right direction, because there was some responsibility taken by platforms like Twitter, and maybe even by Facebook when they flagged some of the content, or they blocked the tweets by Trump, or they rerouted the users to more healthy information on the electoral process. So still, I cannot bring this into a really clear idea on how to change the electoral system. But I think there are a couple of experts in the US around who have already made their suggestions on how to improve the process. And I think it should be a mashup of a closer execution of the media system, and the role that digital companies do play in this context. And it's not only the print newspapers or the more traditional media outlets like maybe Fox News or One American News Network, or maybe even Breitbart. So you have to take into account the role of the digital platforms. And when we talk in this presidential election cycle about the role of maybe Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, in 4 years you maybe have to take into account also what's happening on, say, TikTok or other things to come.
The change of the media system was mentioned, and in a sense, also almost as a final question, what is there to expect from the incoming presidency? And do you see any change in the offing? Will there be a way of changing the system, or will it stay the same over time because it's so difficult? Also media driven.
I think, yeah.
Kathleen?
Shall I continue? Yeah? Oh, Kathleen.
No, here she is.
There you're back.
Okay, sorry, we're back. Yeah, I agree with Professor Bieber that this is perhaps change is needed, or at least some would argue that, but it is very difficult to implement. And certainly the media system in the US is very much an influential factor in why change would be so difficult to implement. But it's sort of not a very exciting answer, but the truth is that it seems very unlikely for anything to change. If we look at from the perspective of elected officials, both Democrats and Republicans have very little incentive to embark on the sort of resource-intensive effort it would require to make such serious and far-reaching change. For a Biden administration to really think through this and to make some big changes would require them to leverage all the political capital they have. And I don't honestly think that they have a lot of political capital given the sort of quote unquote contested nature of this election, though it's not a contested election, it's just perceived to be contested by some. And the absence of a unified government, as other panelists have mentioned, we have a divided government, it would be even more difficult to do anything major. And again, Biden and others, they just have no incentive to do that. Particularly since many of the establishment Democrats, and this is also true of Republicans, benefit from the structures in which they operate. I really see that it is unlikely, absent some sort of extraordinary intervention where there was a real groundswell of support among the American public, that we would see any movement to dismantling the media system, as it were, or reforming the Electoral College, for example. And the honest truth, I think, is that many Americans are eager to put this election behind us and to move forward and kind of have normalcy again. And that is not an information environment that's conducive to talking about major institutional change.
Thank you. Ron, the same question to you, but if it's possible, we could maybe take Peter Bednarz with the final question on board, which is about climate change and how to affect this idea that this might needs to be tackled in the Republican Party. I'm just looking around. Is it possible?
We have a picture. Is this Peter Bednarz? I think so.
Peter Bednarz?
No? Okay, maybe we just...
Maybe he appears in the second, otherwise I'm just going to read out his question. And that sort of, Ron, for you, in terms of what to expect from the coming presidency, what do you think are the driving factors? We talked about reform a little bit, and this question is, climate change is not a leftist fiction. What do you think is the task of the Republican Party to enable sustainable development in the USA? I think that pairs with your comment on gas trucks and how any change can be affected. It's a bit of a lump of a question, but maybe you have a response.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of components of this. One is that number one is the climate of the planet changing? The answer to that is yes. The climate of the planet has been changing for 4 billion years. Number two, what is the effect of human activity on climate change? That is a much more complicated question. Even more complicated than that is there catastrophe that is coming as a result of the human contributions to climate change? That is another component of this. And so one thing is to recognize that the climate is changing. The other component of that is whether to be an alarmist about it. And that is a very interesting discussion to have, which, by the way, that is a discussion which takes place in the Republican Party. It does not take place in the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party treats this almost as a religion, that their catastrophic results of climate change are inevitable, and the only way to affect that is by reducing carbon dioxide emissions, which is so that's an interesting line of thinking, because what that overlooks is elements of mitigation that can be taken. It overlooks one of the greatest dichotomies that I see on the Democratic Party in dealing with climate change is that we have a source of energy that is zero emissions, produces no pollution whatsoever beyond a concentrated nuclear waste, and that is with nuclear power. And so there is even a debate taking place there in terms of is it sustainable for us to build a first world economy only on wind and solar? And I think the answer there is no, because those forms of energy are not concentrated enough to provide an industrial society with the energy needs it has. So I think there are interesting discussions to have on this going forward. But what I don't think you will find is any type of movement within the Republican Party for the United States to take unilateral action to do away with all forms of energy other than wind and solar in the name of climate change. Where I do think that you can come up with, and by the way, one other discussion that nobody wants to have is that if rising sea levels are an issue, why do we continue to subsidize people who build their homes in the path of hurricanes, right? We have a program called the National Flood Insurance Program, which basically subsidizes the insurance costs of building homes directly on the Florida coast where hurricanes come plowing in all of the time. So this is a far more complicated discussion that we can have just within one segment here. I think in terms of the outlook for the Biden administration, they will rejoin the Paris Climate Accord, which of course lets China and India off the hook and continue to, pollute as much as they want. Those countries' goals to start limiting their climate emissions comes in, decades down the road after they've built their industrial capacity. So the short answer is, I think there'll continue to be pushes from the Democratic Party to take unilateral action solely directed at reducing carbon dioxide emissions and in no other area. And I think you'll have Republicans use the authority that they have, for example, with a Republican-controlled Senate, to put a stop to much of that as possible. This is a far more complicated discussion than we can have, simply on, between climate change is a very complicated policy and issue that unfortunately most of the media coverage and political discussion only becomes hyper simplistic and very flat and two-dimensional. So I'm sorry I can't give a longer answer. I would love to give a 45-minute answer on this, which I actually have, but I think our time constraints would limit that.
Peter would still disagree with you. What is still, maybe briefly, what is your outlook on the incoming presidency? Is there change on the horizon? Will there be a different electoral system at any point? Or will those predictions that we've heard before from Kathleen and Christoph become truth, that essentially nobody has a real interest in change and therefore it will stay this contested, maybe this good? Is also a perspective.
There are two related issues here. One is campaign finance and how campaigns are paid for, and the other is the media. And these are related, although not 100% overlap. On the campaign finance side, I think this has become a total mess because the limits on campaigns that do not apply to outside groups means that hundreds of millions of dollars are being shoveled into groups that engage in political speech but cannot be held accountable by the voters. And so I think we need reform that puts the emphasis on the candidates who can be held accountable for what's said. And what this is related to is the amount of misinformation that is being put out for people to consume. So much of that information is put out by people who can't be held accountable for it, whereas candidates can be held accountable. So if we want to move them, if we want to move the mouse, we have to move the cheese. And I also have to change my camera here, so excuse me for a moment. If we want to move the mouse, we have to move the cheese, and we have to change the incentive structure, because right now, candidates themselves only account for a small portion of total political spending in politics, and much of that is moved outside because of the crazy incentives and limits that are part of our current system.
Even though your image is frozen, that was very vivid. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kathleen Searles, Christoph Bieber, and Ron Nehring for your insights, which brings us to the end of this panel. Thank you very much, and best to you all.
Thank you.
Und damit kommen wir zurück ins Deutsche, meine Damen und Herren. Wir haben das Programm bearbeitet. Ich bin jedenfalls froh, dass Sie dabei waren. Ich hoffe, dass es interessante Diskussionen waren. Und das Schlusswort gehört selbstverständlich Sandra. Bitte schön.
Ja, dann danke dir, Jens. Ich glaube auch, wir haben 2 spannende Tage verbracht. Wir haben sehr viele Themen berührt. Angefangen beim gesellschaftlichen Zusammenhalt, über die Herausforderungen der politischen Kommunikation, gerade auch unter Corona-Bedingungen, haben über den Tellerrand geschaut, nach Polen, jetzt in die USA. Ich glaube, wir haben sehr viel spannende Einblicke bekommen, sehr viel Motivation auch mitgenommen von dem, was unsere Referenten gesagt haben, alles voran Düsen Tickal und auch Juri Schnöller, der uns aufgerufen hat, da in der Mitte standhaft zu bleiben und unseren Punkt auch zu machen. Zum Schluss bleibt mir natürlich Danke zu sagen. Danke an unsere Referenten, die sich die Zeit genommen haben, uns Einblicke in ihre Arbeit und in ihre Gedankenwelt zu geben. Danke an Sie als Teilnehmerinnen und Teilnehmer, die Sie auch Fragen gestellt haben, und wir hoffen, dass Sie auch in den Chats ein bisschen den Austausch pflegen konnten, den Sie von der IKPK gewohnt sind. Dann danke ich natürlich dem Team der KAS, die sich an verschiedenen